Ask a pilot who has flown both the difference feels like, and they will pause before they answer. Not because the answer is complicated, because the answer is personal in a way that's hard to make someone else understand. One of them, a captain with 40 years and 30,000 hours across half a dozen types, put it this way. Flying the DC-3 was the only time in his career that he felt the sky was something he was actually in, rather than something he was passing through. He retired 3 years ago. He still thinks about the DC-3. In 2026, with aviation more sophisticated, more automated, more safe, and efficient than at any point in his history, there are pilots all over the world who would trade a week in a modern flight deck for a single afternoon in the left seat of an aircraft designed in 1935. This is the story of why. To understand what pilots miss about the DC-3, you have to understand what flying was when the DC-3 was the state of the art. Not the technology, the experience, what it felt like to be a pilot in an era when the aircraft demanded everything you had, and the sky didn't apologize for its conditions, and the relationship between a pilot and his machine was physical and immediate and completely unmediated by anything electronic. Commercial aviation in the mid-1930s was young enough that nobody had yet decided what it was supposed to be. The routes were new. The airports were often little more than grass strips with a windsock and a fuel pump. The weather forecasting available to pilots was rudimentary by any modern standard. You could get a general picture of what conditions were expected, but the specifics of what you'd encounter over a mountain range or across an open plain were things you found out by flying into them. Navigation was a combination of radio beacons, dead reckoning, and looking out the window at the landscape below and matching it to a map on your knee. This was not romantic in the moment. It was demanding, frequently uncomfortable, and occasionally genuinely dangerous in ways that the pilots of that era accepted as simply the conditions of the work. But it produced something in the pilots who did it, a relationship with flying that was built from complete engagement, from the necessity of being fully present in every moment of every flight because the aircraft and the environment both demanded it. The DC-3 arrived into this world in 1936 and immediately became its defining instrument. Not because it made flying easier, it was still hard, still physical, still demanding in all the ways that flying in that era was demanding. But it made flying possible at a scale and with a reliability that changed what commercial aviation could be. The airlines that operated it found for the first time that they could carry passengers profitably. The pilots who flew it found for the first time that they had an aircraft capable enough to focus on the flying rather than fighting the machine's limitations. What the DC-3 gave pilots, above everything else, was a platform for the full expression of what flying skill actually meant in that era. Every approach was a negotiation. Every landing was an achievement. Every long sector across difficult terrain was a demonstration of judgment, technique, and the deep physical literacy of the sky that only comes from years of exposure to it in a machine that cannot hide what the sky is doing. The pilots who built their careers on the DC-3 in those years were not just learning an aircraft, they were learning flying at a level of depth and directness that the aircraft demands made unavoidable, and that learning absorbed into hands and instinct and the particular confidence of someone who has been tested by something real never entirely left them, no matter what they flew afterward. That is the world the DC-3 came from, and understanding it is the only way to understand what pilots are actually mourning when they say they missed the aircraft in 2026. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The DC-3 was different from modern aircraft in ways that go far deeper than age and technology. It was different in its fundamental philosophy of what the relationship between a pilot and an aircraft should be, and that philosophical difference is precisely what pilots are describing when they say they miss it. Modern aircraft are designed as an explicit engineering priority to minimize the pilot's workload. Automation handles the routine. Computers monitor the systems. Flight management systems calculate the optimal profile and the autopilot executes it. The pilot's role has shifted deliberately and for very good safety reasons from active physical operator to supervisory manager. You set parameters. You monitor performance. You intervene when the automation reaches its limits or encounters a situation it wasn't designed to handle. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how the industry has achieved the extraordinary safety record of contemporary commercial aviation.
The DC-3 had none of this, not because the technology didn't exist in sophisticated enough form, but because the aircraft predated the entire philosophy. There was no autopilot in the early DC-3s, or it was rudimentary enough that pilots didn't trust it in conditions that mattered. There was no flight management system. There was no envelope protection to prevent the pilot from exceeding the aircraft's structural limits if his inputs demanded it. There was the aircraft, and the pilot, and the sky. And the pilot was responsible for managing all three simultaneously with his hands and his judgment and the direct physical feedback of an aircraft that communicated what it was doing through every surface it touched. The yoke of a DC-3 requires genuine physical input, not the light, almost symbolic pressure that a modern side-stick requires, but actual force, graduated, sensitive force that varies with speed and configuration in ways that give a pilot continuous physical information about what the aircraft is doing. Pilots describe flying the DC-3 as a full-body activity. Your hands feel the airspeed through the control forces. Your feet on the rudder pedals feel the yaw. The seat of your trousers, as old aviators used to say with only partial irony, tells you things that no instrument can. The engines require active management in a way that modern turbofan engines managed by FADEC, the computer systems that govern contemporary jet engines, simply don't. Mixture, propeller pitch, power settings, all of it requires continuous pilot attention and adjustment as altitude and temperature and power requirements change throughout a flight. This sounds like workload. It is workload, and pilots who flew the DC-3 regularly described that workload not as a burden, but as a conversation, a continuous exchange of information between themselves and the aircraft that kept them engaged, present, and intimately aware of everything the machine was doing. The landing was perhaps the most revealing test of what the DC-3 asked from its pilots and what it gave back in return. The tailwheel configuration means the aircraft approaches with its nose high, the pilot looking at the sky rather than the runway in the final moments before touchdown. The transition from approach to flare to touchdown requires a sequence of inputs, elevator, throttle, rudder, that must be timed with a precision that takes genuine experience to develop and that produces, when done correctly, a greaser of a landing that experienced DC-3 pilots describe as one of the most satisfying physical sensations in aviation. Done incorrectly, it produces a bounce, or swerve, or the particular combination of both that humbles student pilots and occasionally catches experienced ones off guard. Crosswind landings in the DC-3 are their own chapter. The aircraft demands active coordination of rudder and aileron throughout the approach and landing role, in a way that modern aircraft with their more forgiving handling largely don't. Pilots who could land the DC-3 consistently well in a crosswind had developed a skill that was recognizable to other pilots as skill, something achieved, something earned, something that couldn't be faked or bypassed by automation. This is what pilots miss. Not the workload itself, nobody genuinely misses fatigue, but the engagement that the workload produced, the sense of being, at every moment of every flight, actively and physically in conversation with the aircraft and the sky, the feeling that your presence in the cockpit was not supervisory but essential, that the aircraft needed you specifically, your hands and your judgment and your feel for what it was doing, and that your response to what it needed was what made the difference between a good flight and a difficult one. Modern aviation has optimized away that conversation, for very good reasons, but something was lost in the optimization, and the pilots who experienced both sides of it know exactly what it was.
The human experience of the DC-3 is told in a specific register that you don't encounter when pilots talk about other aircraft. It is the register of people describing a relationship, not a tool, not a type, not a phase of their career, but something closer to a partnership that shaped who they became as aviators and in ways they don't always articulate directly as people. Pilots who flew DC-3s for significant portions of their careers consistently describe the aircraft in the present tense, even when talking about flights from 40 or 50 years ago. Not it was, but it is. Not I flew it, but I fly it. A grammatical slip that reveals something real about the quality of presence the aircraft created in the people who operated it. The DC-3 didn't just occupy a chapter of their flying lives. It occupied them, in the full sense of that word, during every hour they spent in its cockpit. One retired captain who flew DC-3s in bush routes in Canada through the 1970s and 1980s, long after the aircraft had left mainline commercial service elsewhere, describes the experience this way.
Every flight was different because the aircraft made sure you noticed the difference. The weather was different, the load was different, the strip condition was different, and the DC-3 communicated all of those differences through its controls and its behavior in a way that kept him learning, he said, for 20 years on the same type. He flew more sophisticated aircraft later in his career. He says he never learned as much from any of them. Female pilots who flew DC-3s, fewer in that era, but present, particularly in the post-war years as aviation opened incrementally, described the physical demands of the aircraft with a directness that male pilots sometimes soften with humor. The DC-3 didn't make concessions to anyone. It asked the same things of every pilot, regardless of background or experience: physical engagement, continuous attention, genuine technique, and it rewarded those things equally regardless of who was providing them. Several women who built their careers on the DC-3 describe it as the aircraft that established their professional credibility in an era when that credibility was not freely given, because skill on the DC-3 was visible and unmistakable in a way that skill on more forgiving aircraft is not. The mechanics who maintain DC-3s have their own chapter of this story, and it runs alongside the pilot's chapter with a different but complementary quality. The DC-3 structure and systems are not simple, but they are comprehensible, completely fully comprehensible in the way a craftsman comprehends a complex but logical tool. Mechanics who spent careers on the type describe knowing it the way you know a language you grew up speaking, not by translating it in your head, but by thinking in it directly. One veteran mechanic describes signing off a DC-3 for flight as one of the few moments in his working life when he felt completely certain that he understood exactly what he was certifying, exactly what the aircraft would do, exactly what its margins were. That certainty, he said, was a gift the aircraft gave him, and he never quite found it on anything that came after. The DC-3's conflict was never dramatic. It was a conflict of being surpassed, gradually, inevitably, on the metrics that the industry used to measure progress, while remaining stubbornly, irreplaceably relevant on the metrics the industry didn't measure because it didn't know how. The jet age arrived and the DC-3 stepped aside on the routes where speed and scale mattered. The economics of the 1960s and 1970s favored larger aircraft, faster aircraft that could carry more passengers further on less fuel. The DC-3 couldn't compete on any of those terms. It didn't try to. It moved to the routes where those terms didn't apply. The bush routes, the island hops, the remote community connections where the runway was short and unprepared, and the aircraft needed to be able to absorb the kind of operation that no modern airliner is certified to attempt. In those contexts, the DC-3 didn't just survive, it thrived. And in thriving on the margins of what aviation had become, it preserved something that was being lost at the center: a kind of flying and a kind of pilot that the mainline industry was in the process of making unnecessary. The pilots who stayed with the DC-3 as it moved to these roles made a choice, whether they framed it that way or not. They chose the aircraft that asked the most of them over the aircraft that offered the most comfort. They chose engagement over efficiency, and most of them, looking back from the distance of retirement, described that choice as the best professional decision they ever made, not because it advanced their careers in conventional terms, but because it gave them a relationship with flying that the conventional career path was increasingly unable to provide. In 2026, the DC-3's legacy is visible in two completely different places, and both of them say something important. The first place is the sky. DC-3s are still airborne, still operating commercially in remote parts of the world, where the combination of capabilities the aircraft offers remains unmatched by anything designed to replace it. The pilots who fly them today are carrying on a tradition of engagement with an aircraft that is almost 90 years old, and they describe the experience in terms that would be immediately recognizable to the pilots who first flew the type in 1936. The aircraft hasn't changed, what it asks of pilots hasn't changed, and what it gives back to the pilots who meet its demands hasn't changed either. The second place is the conversation, the specific, animated, affectionate conversation that happens whenever pilots who have flown the DC-3 encounter each other, or encounter someone who asks them about it.
In aviation circles, that conversation is recognizable from a distance. The hands start moving, the voice changes register, the years fall away, and the person in front of you is back in the left seat of an aircraft that is asking everything they have and getting it. That conversation is happening right now, somewhere in the world, among people for whom the DC-3 is not history, but memory, living, present, affectionately irreplaceable memory. The DC-3's legacy is not what it was. It is what it made. The pilots it shaped, the standard of engagement it established, the proof it provided across nearly 90 years of continuous operation that flying at its best is not a transaction but a conversation between a pilot and a machine and a sky that will always have something new to say to the person paying close enough attention to hear it. We began with a question. Why in 2026 do pilots still miss the DC-3? I think the honest answer is that they don't miss the aircraft exactly. They miss the version of themselves that the DC-3 called forward, fully present, physically engaged, in continuous conversation with a machine that needed them specifically, and communicated that need through every surface it touched. Modern aviation is extraordinary. It is safer than the DC-3 era by every measure that matters. It carries more people, further, more reliably, with more comfort and less risk than anything the pilots of 1936 could have imagined. All of that is true and worth celebrating, but something was traded for it. The directness of the relationship between pilot and aircraft, the physicality of flying an aircraft that told you everything through your hands, the particular satisfaction of a skill that was visible in its exercise and unmistakable in its absence. The DC-3 was, in the end, an aircraft that made pilots feel like pilots, in the most complete sense of that word. And the pilots who experienced that feeling, and then experienced its absence in the aircraft that came after, know exactly what they are mourning when they say they miss it. They are mourning a conversation that the industry, for all the right reasons, decided to end. The DC-3, somewhere, is still having it. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.